The war nobody declared. How the United States and Venezuela became enemies without ever firing the first shot. Imagine waking up one morning and realizing that your country has been at war for decades, but no one ever announced it. No bombs falling, no troops marching, no official declaration, just pressure. Slow, constant, invisible pressure. This is the story of the United States and Venezuela, a conflict that didn't start with guns, but with fear. To understand why these two nations became enemies, we have to go back, not just years, but generations, to a time when Venezuela wasn't a problem for Washington at all. In fact, it was a dream. In the early 20th century, Venezuela was one of America's favorite partners in Latin America. It was stable, cooperative, and most importantly, rich in oil. Very rich. By the 1920s, massive oil reserves were discovered beneath Venezuelan soil, and American companies rushed in. Standard Oil, Gulf Oil, Exxon. They didn't just extract oil, they shaped the country. For decades, Venezuela became one of the largest oil suppliers to the United States. Its government stayed friendly, its economy stayed open, and Washington stayed comfortable. This relationship lasted for nearly half a century. So what changed? The Cold War. When the Cold War began, the United States stopped seeing countries as nations and started seeing them as potential threats. Not because of what they did, but because of what they believed. Latin America became a chessboard. Any government that leaned left, even slightly, was suddenly suspicious. And Venezuela watched this carefully. For years, it tried to walk a careful line. It remained democratic. It remained capitalist. But underneath the surface, something was building. Inequality. Despite all that oil wealth, most Venezuelans lived in poverty. While foreign corporations and local elites prospered, ordinary people struggled. This contradiction planted a seed, and that seed would grow into something Washington never expected. In 1998, a former military officer was elected president. His name was Hugo Chavez, and from the moment he took office, everything changed. Chavez didn't whisper. He didn't negotiate quietly. He spoke loudly, emotionally, directly to the poor. He talked about sovereignty, about dignity, about taking Venezuela's oil back from foreign hands. To many Venezuelans, he was a hero. To Washington, he was a nightmare. Because Chavez didn't just criticize U.S. policy, he challenged it. He rewrote the Constitution, nationalized oil resources, increased state control over the economy, and most dangerously of all, he inspired others. Across Latin America, leaders watched Venezuela and thought, what if we did the same? This was Washington's greatest fear. Not Chavez himself, but the idea that independence could spread. In 2002, everything exploded. A coup attempt removed Chavez from power for 48 hours, and the United States did not condemn it. In fact, U.S. officials appeared to support the new temporary government. But something unexpected happened. The people brought Chavez back. Mass protests, loyal military units, an unstoppable wave. The coup collapsed, and from that moment on, trust between Venezuela and the United States was dead, completely. Chavez never forgot. Washington never forgave. What followed wasn't open war, but something more subtle. Economic pressure, political isolation, media warfare. The United States began to frame Venezuela not just as a problem, but as a threat. And Chavez leaned into it. He called the U.S. an empire. He mocked American presidents. He aligned himself with Cuba, Iran, and Russia. Every speech widened the gap. Every policy hardened positions. And then there was oil. Oil was always the heart of this conflict. Venezuela holds the largest proven oil reserves on Earth, more than Saudi Arabia. For Washington, this wasn't just about ideology, it was about control, energy security, market stability, global influence. When Venezuela used oil as a political weapon, offering cheap oil to allies and cutting ties with U.S. companies, it crossed a red line. The response came slowly but relentlessly: sanctions. At first, targeted, then broader, then crushing. Officially, sanctions were about democracy and human rights, but on the ground, they hit oil production, banking access, food imports, medicine, and ordinary Venezuelans paid the price. By the time Chavez died in 2013, the conflict was no longer personal, it was structural. His successor, Nicolas Maduro, inherited a broken economy and an unforgiving world. Oil prices collapsed, mismanagement worsened, sanctions tightened. The United States openly recognized an opposition leader as president, something almost unheard of. At this point, Venezuela wasn't just isolated, it was cornered. And when nations are cornered, they don't behave predictably. This is where our story gets darker, because what started as ideological tension became economic warfare, and what looks like policy on paper feels like survival on the ground. In the next part of this podcast, we'll explore how oil, sanctions, and global power struggles turned Venezuela into a battlefield without a single missile launched, and why this conflict still matters, not just for Caracas or Washington, but for the entire world. Sanctions, oil, and the silent battlefield. How economic warfare replaced guns. Wars used to be loud. They came with explosions, uniforms, maps, and victories announced on paper. But modern wars are different. They happen quietly, through banks, through shipping routes, through software, paperwork, and blocked accounts. And this is exactly how the war between the United States and Venezuela entered its most dangerous phase. Not with bombs, but with sanctions. Officially, sanctions are described as peaceful tools. They are supposed to pressure governments without hurting people. But in reality, sanctions don't land on politicians. They land on economies. And Venezuela's economy was already fragile, almost entirely dependent on oil. When oil prices were high, Venezuela survived despite mismanagement. But when prices collapsed in the mid-2010s, the country had no backup plan. That was the moment sanctions became devastating. The United States restricted Venezuela's access to international banking. Oil revenues were frozen, assets were seized, companies were warned. Do business with Venezuela, and you lose access to the U.S. financial system. Most companies didn't hesitate. They walked away. Oil production collapsed, refineries shut down, tankers sat idle, and suddenly a country sitting on the largest oil reserves in the world couldn't sell its oil. This wasn't accidental. Oil was always the pressure point, because whoever controls oil controls survival. Without oil revenue, Venezuela couldn't import enough food, couldn't import medicine, couldn't maintain infrastructure. Power, fear, and the future. What happens if this war never ends? There is a dangerous myth in global politics. The myth that conflicts eventually resolve themselves, that time heals tension, that pressure forces compromise, that silence means peace. The relationship between the United States and Venezuela proves the opposite. Because this conflict didn't fade, it adapted. Today, Venezuela is no longer just a country under pressure. It is a lesson, a living example of what happens when a nation is pushed out of the global system and forced to build a new one in the shadows. The United States still holds enormous power, but its tools are no longer unquestioned. Sanctions once felt absolute. Now they are studied, bypassed, weakened. Oil once flowed only through Western markets. Now it finds new routes. Currencies once depended on the dollar. Now alternatives are whispered, tested, slowly normalized. And Venezuela sits right in the middle of this transition. Not because it planned to, but because it was forced to. This is what makes the conflict so dangerous, because neither side can easily retreat. If the United States eases pressure, it risks signaling weakness, not just to Venezuela, but to the entire world. If Venezuela compromises, it risks internal collapse and the loss of everything it claims to stand for. So both sides stay locked, frozen. But frozen conflicts still produce heat. Tension builds in unexpected ways. Through cyber operations, through oil tankers seized at sea, through covert diplomacy and proxy alliances. The risk is not a traditional war. The risk is miscalculation. One wrong interception, one blocked shipment, one internal crisis blamed on the outside, and suddenly, a conflict that was never declared becomes impossible to ignore. There's another uncomfortable truth we need to face. This conflict has become useful. For Washington, Venezuela is a symbol, a warning against defiance. For Caracas, the United States is a convenient enemy, a reason to rally support and deflect blame. And when enemies are useful, peace becomes inconvenient. Meanwhile, ordinary people remain trapped in the middle. Sanctions don't punish leaders, they punish time. They steal years, opportunities, generations. And yet, despite everything, Venezuela has not disappeared. It hasn't collapsed into chaos the way many predicted. It hasn't surrendered. It adapted. Slowly, painfully, imperfectly. That alone should force us to ask harder questions. What if pressure doesn't produce democracy? What if isolation creates resilience instead of collapse? What if the future of global power is not decided by who is strongest, but by who can endure the longest? This is why the conflict between the United States and Venezuela matters far beyond these two nations. It is a preview, a rehearsal, a warning sign for a world shifting away from simple dominance. As new powers rise and old systems strain, conflicts like this will multiply. Not loud wars, but quiet ones. Wars fought through trade, finance, technology, and influence. Wars where the battlefield is invisible, but the consequences are everywhere. So here is the final question. Not for politicians, not for governments, but for all of us. If the world is moving toward fragmentation instead of unity, if power is no longer absolute, if pressure no longer guarantees control, then how many more wars will be fought like this one? Undeclared, endless, silent. And how long before we realize that the absence of explosions does not mean the absence of destruction? This was not just the story of the United States and Venezuela. It was the story of the world we are entering, and whether we are ready for it or not.